Every decision you've made today was influenced by forces you cannot see. The car you drive, the clothes you wear, the content you consume, the person you're attracted to, even the career path you've chosen. You believe these were your choices, your preferences, your authentic self-expression. What if I told you they weren't? What if the most personal aspects of your identity, your desires, your fears, your very sense of purpose, were being orchestrated by ancient patterns embedded deep within your unconscious mind? Patterns that corporations have learned to exploit, that politicians have learned to trigger, that technology has learned to amplify. You're being guided by symbols, silent messengers that bypass your rational mind and speak directly to the oldest, most primitive parts of your psyche. They shape your behavior while allowing you to maintain the comforting illusion of conscious choice. Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist, recognized this invisible architecture of influence nearly a century ago. He saw how symbols function as psychological operators' hidden levers that, when pulled, reliably produce predictable human responses. He warned that a society ignorant of these symbolic forces would inevitably become manipulated by those who understood them. Look around. Marketing that bypasses reason to trigger unconscious desire. Political messaging designed to activate tribal instincts. Social media algorithms that exploit archetypal cravings for connection, status, and meaning. The manipulation Jung foresaw has become our daily reality. The most dangerous prison isn't built with concrete walls and iron bars. It's constructed from symbolic structures that shape your perception without your awareness or consent. A cage made not of steel, but of meaning. And the most disturbing part? You help maintain your own captivity. Every time you respond to these symbolic triggers without consciousness, you strengthen their hold. Your attention, your engagement, your purchasing power all reinforce the very system that constrains your psychological freedom. But Jung didn't just diagnose this condition. He offered a path toward liberation, a way to recognize these symbolic influences, to understand their power, and ultimately to transform your relationship with them. Today, we're going to venture behind the curtain of ordinary awareness. We'll decode the symbolic language that's been guiding your decisions without your knowledge, and we'll discover how reclaiming your relationship with these symbols might be the most revolutionary act of freedom available in our hyper-manipulated age. Are you ready to see how deep the rabbit hole goes? To understand how symbols guide our behavior, we need to explore Carl Jung's revolutionary model of the human psyche. But don't worry, we're going to translate these profound ideas into everyday language that reveals their practical impact on your daily life. Jung proposed that the mind isn't limited to conscious awareness and personal memories. Beneath our individual consciousness lies what he called the collective unconscious, a shared psychological inheritance containing patterns common to all humanity. These patterns, which Jung named archetypes, function as universal templates for human experience. Think of archetypes as the psychological equivalent of instincts, innate predispositions that shape how we perceive and respond to life situations. Just as your body knows how to breathe without being taught, your psyche is pre-wired to recognize and respond to certain fundamental patterns. The mother, the father, the hero, the shadow, the self, to name just a few. These archetypal patterns aren't accessible directly. They can only be experienced through symbols, images, stories, or objects that serve as bridges between conscious awareness and unconscious content. Symbols act as psychological transformers, converting archetypal energy into forms we can perceive and engage with. Here's where it gets interesting. Jung discovered that certain symbols reliably evoke specific psychological responses across cultural boundaries. A circle isn't just a geometric shape. It universally evokes feelings of wholeness and completion. A snake isn't just a reptile. It consistently triggers associations with transformation and hidden knowledge. These symbolic responses aren't taught. They emerge from the archetypal structures of the human psyche itself. This might sound abstract, but the implications are profoundly practical. If certain symbols consistently trigger predictable psychological responses, then whoever controls those symbols gains immense influence over human behavior. The ability to activate archetypes through symbolic communication becomes a powerful tool for both liberation and manipulation. Jung warned about this symbolic influence decades before the rise of modern marketing, media, and technology. He recognized that symbols speak directly to the unconscious, bypassing rational filters. When you encounter a potent symbol, you don't decide to respond. You simply respond, often without realizing why. Consider Jung's concept of numinosity, the emotional charge that surrounds certain symbols. When you encounter a numinous symbol, you feel its significance before you understand it. It commands your attention, evokes emotional response, and influences your behavior through an authority that feels almost magical. This numinous quality explains why religious symbols, national flags, and brand logos can evoke such powerful reactions despite being mere arrangements of shape and color. The darker implication of Jung's theory is that those who understand symbolic communication can influence masses of people without their conscious awareness. By activating archetypal content through carefully designed symbols, it becomes possible to guide human behavior while maintaining the illusion of free choice. Jung identified several mechanisms through which symbolic influence operates. First, projection. The unconscious tendency to attribute inner content to external objects. When a symbol activates an archetypal pattern within you, you experience that activation as coming from the symbol itself, rather than from your own psyche. This creates the illusion that the symbol possesses inherent power, when in fact it's activating power that already exists within you. Second, identification. The unconscious merging of identity with archetypal content. When a powerful symbol triggers an archetypal response, you don't just recognize the archetype. You temporarily become it. Your perception, emotion, and behavior align with the activated pattern, often overriding your normal personality. Third, inflation. The dangerous expansion of ego consciousness that occurs when you fail to distinguish between your personal identity and archetypal energies. This happens when symbols trigger such powerful responses that you mistake archetypal content for personal attributes, leading to delusions of grandeur or persecution. Jung observed that these mechanisms operate most powerfully when we remain unconscious of them. The less aware you are of symbolic influence, the more completely you'll be guided by it. Conversely, bringing these processes into consciousness reduces their automatic control over your behavior. This creates a troubling dynamic in modern society. As our environment becomes increasingly saturated with engineered symbols, from corporate logos to political imagery to algorithmic content feeds, we experience more symbolic influence with less conscious awareness of that influence. Jung's concept of autonomous complexes explains why this matters. Complexes are emotionally charged clusters of ideas and images that develop around archetypal cores. When activated by appropriate symbols, these complexes can temporarily take over your personality, influencing perception and behavior in ways disconnected from your conscious intentions. Think about moments when you found yourself behaving in ways that later seemed foreign to your normal personality. Perhaps in states of intense anger, infatuation, or fear. These episodes often involve symbolic triggers that activated unconscious complexes, temporarily overriding your conscious control. The most disturbing aspect of Jung's theory is that symbolic communication can create psychological bypass routes around rational thought. When skillfully employed, symbols don't need to persuade you logically. They simply activate pre-existing archetypal patterns that guide your behavior without conscious deliberation. But Jung wasn't a pessimist. While he recognized the manipulative potential of symbolic influence, he also saw symbols as essential tools for psychological integration and healing. The same symbolic pathways that enable manipulation can also facilitate profound transformation when engaged consciously. Jung called this conscious engagement with symbolic content active imagination, a process of deliberately exploring and dialoguing with the symbolic material that emerges from your unconscious. Through active imagination, you can transform your relationship with symbols from unconscious reaction to conscious participation. This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's insight. The symbols that unconsciously guide you can become instruments for liberation once you recognize their influence. The key isn't rejecting symbolic communication, but developing what Jung called symbolic literacy, the ability to recognize, interpret, and consciously engage with the symbolic dimensions of experience. In an age of unprecedented symbolic manipulation, Jung's warning has never been more relevant. Those who remain unconscious of symbolic influence will inevitably be guided by those who understand it. But those who develop symbolic literacy gain access to extraordinary possibilities for psychological freedom and authentic self-expression. Let's move from theory to practice. How does Jung's understanding of symbolic influence manifest in your everyday reality? The examples are everywhere once you know what to look for. Consider the world of consumer marketing. Companies don't just sell products, they sell archetypal fulfillment through symbolic association. Apple doesn't market computers. It markets the creator and rebel archetypes through minimalist design and think different messaging. Coca-Cola doesn't sell flavored sugar water. It sells the archetypal experience of connection and joy through images of shared happiness. This symbolic marketing bypasses rational decision-making. You don't consciously decide that a particular car will fulfill your hero archetype's need for conquest. The symbolic messaging activates that archetypal pattern unconsciously, creating a feeling of rightness that you later rationalize as a practical choice. A revealing study from consumer psychology found that people shown luxury brand logos subsequently made decisions reflecting increased self-interest and decreased empathy behaviors associated with the archetypal king-queen energy these brands symbolically evoke. The participants reported no awareness that the brand symbols had influenced their behavior. Political messaging operates through similar symbolic mechanisms. Political symbols don't persuade through rational argument. They activate archetypal patterns that guide perception and behavior. National flags, party emblems, and campaign imagery all function as symbolic triggers for pre-existing psychological complexes. A controversial but revealing experiment demonstrated that showing participants rapid subliminal images of their nation's flag significantly shifted political opinions toward more nationalistic positions, without participants having any conscious awareness of seeing the flag. The symbolic activation occurred completely below the threshold of conscious perception. Even more disturbing is how modern political campaigns use archetypal messaging to trigger what Jung called shadow projection, the unconscious attribution of disowned qualities to others. By symbolically activating the collective shadow, campaigns can reliably generate fear and hatred toward outgroups without making rational arguments against them. Social media platforms have engineered perhaps the most sophisticated symbolic manipulation systems in human history. These platforms don't just connect people, they create symbolic environments that continuously activate archetypal patterns related to social acceptance, status, and tribal belonging. The notification symbol, a small red circle with a number inside, functions as a powerful archetypal trigger for what Jung would recognize as the recognition complex. This simple symbol reliably activates dopamine pathways associated with social reward, creating compulsive checking behaviors that override conscious intentions. A study on social media engagement revealed that content containing certain archetypal symbols, particularly those related to transformation, conflict, or transcendence, consistently generated higher engagement regardless of the actual information presented. Users reported being drawn to this content without understanding why, a classic example of unconscious symbolic influence. Even intimate relationships aren't immune to symbolic guidance. Jung observed that romantic attraction often involves the projection of anima, animus archetypes, unconscious contrasexual components of the psyche. These projections get activated by individuals who symbolically embody qualities associated with your inner anima or animus. This explains the puzzling phenomenon of intelligent people repeatedly choosing partners who symbolically match their anima, animus projection, even when those relationships prove destructive. The symbolic activation is so powerful it overrides practical considerations and past experience. A particularly troubling manifestation of symbolic influence appears in what Jung called mass psychosis, collective psychological states, where large groups become dominated by specific archetypal energies. Historical examples include the symbolically driven mass movements of the 20th century, but modern versions emerge through viral social media phenomena that rapidly spread symbolic contagion. Consider how certain symbols can instantly transform ordinary individuals into passionate advocates or opponents of complex issues they barely understand. The symbolic activation doesn't convey information. It triggers archetypal patterns that come with pre-packaged emotional responses and behavioral scripts. One shocking experiment demonstrated that participants exposed to culturally significant symbols subsequently endorsed attitudes and behaviors consistent with those symbols, even when these contradicted their previously stated values. The symbolic influence occurred without conscious recognition and persisted even when the symbols were presented too briefly for conscious recognition. The symbolic manipulation extends to physical environments. Shopping malls aren't just retail spaces, they're symbolic structures designed to activate archetypal patterns associated with abundance, transformation, and rebirth. The typical mall layout, with its circular paths, central fountains, and threshold experiences, symbolically replicates ancient initiatory spaces that Jung recognized as manifestations of transformation archetypes. Studies of consumer behavior show that people make significantly different purchasing decisions in environments containing symbols of abundance versus environments lacking these symbols, even when the actual products and prices remain identical. The symbolic context unconsciously guides behavior without registering in conscious awareness. Perhaps most disturbing is how digital technology enables unprecedented personalization of symbolic triggers. Modern algorithms don't just track your behavior, they identify which symbolic patterns most reliably influence your specific psychological complexes. This creates the possibility of individualized symbolic manipulation tailored to your unique archetypal vulnerabilities. A controversial advertising study found that campaigns using symbols selected based on psychological profiles achieved nearly 3 times the conversion rate of generic approaches, with participants reporting no greater awareness of being influenced. The symbolic messaging wasn't more persuasive. It simply activated pre-existing psychological patterns more effectively. Even supposedly rational domains like finance show evidence of symbolic guidance. Stock market movements often follow patterns that Jung would recognize as archetypal rather than rational. Market crashes display the psychological characteristics of collective shadow eruptions, while bull markets show the hallmarks of inflation and hubris associated with the hero archetype's overextension. A revealing analysis of financial news coverage identified consistent symbolic patterns preceding major market movements. Imagery and language associated with specific archetypes reliably appeared before corresponding market behaviors, suggesting that collective psychological states precede and potentially cause economic events, rather than merely reflecting them. These examples reveal an uncomfortable truth. Your behavior is being guided by symbolic influences that operate largely outside your conscious awareness, not because you're uniquely susceptible, but because this symbolic guidance system is built into the basic architecture of the human psyche. Jung didn't just predict this symbolic influence. He recognized it as an inescapable aspect of human psychology. But he also offered a path forward. By developing symbolic literacy, the ability to recognize, interpret, and consciously engage with symbolic content, you can transform your relationship with these influences from unconscious reaction to conscious participation. And we've recognized the troubling reality that this symbolic guidance system is being systematically exploited by those who understand its mechanics. We've ventured through the hidden terrain of symbolic influence, exposing the invisible architecture that shapes your perception and behavior. We've seen how archetypal patterns activated through symbolic communication guide your decisions without your conscious awareness. But this knowledge isn't meant to leave you feeling manipulated or powerless. Quite the opposite. As Jung himself recognized, awareness is the essential first step toward psychological liberation. You cannot free yourself from influences you do not perceive. The path forward isn't rejecting symbolic communication, an impossible task given the fundamental role symbols play in human psychology. The path is developing what Jung called symbolic literacy, the capacity to recognize, interpret, and consciously engage with the symbolic dimensions of your experience. This journey toward symbolic literacy begins with simple but profound self-observation. Start noticing your spontaneous emotional reactions to symbols in your environment. That logo that inexplicably appeals to you. That political imagery that triggers immediate aversion. That movie character that deeply resonates with something in your psyche. These responses aren't random. They're evidence of archetypal activation. Pay attention to patterns in your behavior that seem to emerge spontaneously in certain symbolic contexts. Notice how your personality shifts in different environments containing different symbolic elements. These variations aren't mere mood changes. They're evidence of different archetypal energies being constellated by symbolic triggers. The media you consume. The spaces you inhabit. These aren't neutral elements. They're symbolic systems that continuously activate specific archetypal patterns within your psyche, guiding your perception and behavior in ways you've likely never considered. Begin questioning the symbolic environment you've surrounded yourself with, the brands you prefer. Examine your most important relationships through a symbolic lens. What archetypal energies are you projecting onto significant others? What symbolic role do you unconsciously assign them in your personal mythology? These projections aren't failures. They're opportunities to reclaim disowned aspects of your own psychological potential. Challenge yourself to consciously engage with symbols that spontaneously attract or repel you. Rather than automatically responding to their influence, ask what these symbols represent within your psyche. What unconscious content are they activating? What psychological function do they serve? This questioning transforms unconscious reaction into conscious relationship. This practice of symbolic literacy isn't about achieving perfect freedom from symbolic influence, an impossible goal given the structure of human psychology. It's about transforming your relationship with symbols from unconscious subjugation to conscious participation. It's about becoming an active collaborator in your own psychological development rather than a passive recipient of symbolic programming. The revolutionary potential of Jung's insight isn't just personal, it's profoundly social. A population educated in symbolic literacy would be fundamentally less susceptible to manipulation through archetypal triggers. The very symbolic techniques currently used to guide behavior unconsciously could become tools for collective psychological integration and authentic cultural renewal. Jung saw that symbols aren't inherently manipulative. They're psychologically necessary bridges between conscious and unconscious dimensions of experience. The problem isn't symbolic communication itself, but the unconsciousness with which we typically engage it. Developing symbolic literacy doesn't mean rejecting symbols. It means reclaiming your relationship with them. This reclamation represents perhaps the most important form of freedom available in our hyper-manipulated age. Not freedom from symbolic influence, which would be psychologically impossible, but freedom through conscious engagement with the symbolic dimensions of experience. So I challenge you. Wake up to the symbolic forces guiding your behavior. Question the spontaneous reactions that seem to arise from nowhere. Examine the environments, relationships, and media that shape your perception through symbolic means. Recognize the archetypal patterns activated within you by the symbolic systems you encounter daily. This awakening won't be comfortable. As Jung himself warned, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Recognizing how thoroughly symbolic influences have shaped your identity, your desires, and your sense of purpose requires confronting the uncomfortable reality that much of what you consider you has been unconsciously guided by symbolic forces you never chose to accept. But this recognition also opens extraordinary possibilities. By developing symbolic literacy, you gain access to psychological resources previously operating outside your awareness. The very symbolic patterns that once guided you unconsciously become tools for conscious psychological development. The archetypal energies previously triggered without your knowledge become sources of authentic power and creativity. The choice is yours. Remain unconscious of the symbolic influences shaping your reality, or embark on the challenging but infinitely rewarding journey toward symbolic literacy. Continue living as an unconscious recipient of archetypal programming, or become a conscious participant in your own psychological development. As Jung himself said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The time for awakening is now. The symbols are waiting to be read.